So Virtuzone is known in the industry for being the premier provider for all company formation services and corporate services in general. We were founded in 2009. We've helped, give or take, approximately here 60,000 entrepreneurs get onto the journey of setting up their own businesses. One thing that we love to boast about, because it's something unique and quite different in comparison to many other players in the market, 40% of our business actually come from referrals, which indicates that at least the people that we work with are happy and satisfied with our work for them to refer us. So back in 2009, we were obviously much smaller. Now we're an office here in downtown Dubai. We have around 125 staff. We have 3 different locations. We have a location in another Emirate and another location in JLT, also in Dubai. The good thing about us is that when people come to us, they come to us with an idea, and we provide them with a complete solution for everything that they could possibly require in setting up their business. So we tell them what needs to be done, how it needs to be done, what are the options they have available to them. More importantly, because there's around 52 free zones here in the UAE, they get, if they go from one place to the next, or if they want to research the information themselves, they will be filled with a lot of varying informations which are applicable to those specific free zones, but no one's going to be able to give them the consultation to guide them towards the right free zone that is applicable to their price budgets and what they want to do, and more importantly, their long-term plans. So at Virtuzone, when someone comes to us, the primary role of ours is to consult them, to make sure that we understand what they want to do and what they want to achieve. And we make sure that we provide them with options and packages in order for them to achieve those goals. Now, in addition to company formation itself, like I said earlier, we provide corporate services. So anything from visa related, residence visa related, bank account opening, because that's something of concern when people are opening corporate entities here in the UAE. Corporate bank accounts aren't the most straightforward procedure, so we make sure we guide them through the process, because who wants to open up a company and not have a corporate bank account associated to that company? In addition to accounting services, virtual reception services, so we do the whole thing. I don't like to use the word one-stop shop, but that's pretty much what we are. They come to us and we take care of everything. That's a small brief.
Thank you. Thank you, Peter. Now, Dubai, as we all know, seems like a very natural market to expand for most MENA startups, and it's very accommodating. It has this, positive reputation for new business and especially entrepreneurship, with most of the economy comprising of SMEs and startups, and the government certainly supports that. Generally speaking, more often than not, it's made of expatriates or soon-to-be expatriates and foreigners. So the obvious question is, should they go for a mainland kind of license or free zone license? And what differences or pros and cons of each? And how would you explain that to me?
Excellent question to me. You're right with what you said initially. The UAE has created an environment, a business environment, with the infrastructure that they've invested in, with the networks that they've invested in, with the telecommunication bodies that they have, making things as seamless as possible. They have created an environment for people to set up a company and to set up a company successfully, and to be able to not just work within the UAE, but more importantly, and you will notice many of the companies that are based here are based as regional hubs. And in some cases, that company works around the world. So it's, when we need to look at an infrastructure of a country, it's the UAE has made sure that whoever comes here can work with not just companies or people within the UAE, but can work with the world. And that's something that they should be lauded about and appreciated, because it's something that is quite unique in comparison to many other countries here in the region. Now, with regards to your question about free zones and mainlands, that's been the long time argument. What should I do here and there? But to us, it's quite straightforward. It's straightforward on a variety of levels. Now, around 6 months ago, the UAE changed many of the rules and regulations associated with setting up in the mainland. In the past, you would need to have, for many of the types of activities, not all, but many of the activities, you would have to have a 51% owner, being a local owner. Of course, there were side agreements in place protecting the real owners and the profit and loss of that company going towards the real owners, and that person just being on the license itself. Those rules have changed, and the UAE have encouraged and provided an option for the majority of activities, not all, but the majority of activities where you not require a local sponsor and you can have 100% ownership, specifically for commercial entities. For professional entities, it was always 100%, but there was something called a local service agent, which is still in place, and that's just part of the procedure and nothing specific. Free zones, on the other hand, have always been 100% ownership. And that's one of the things that attracted me. If you looked at the trends in the past, I'll give you an example of Virtue Zone. 70% of the companies that, if not more, of the companies that we have set up under free zones. And I'm going to tie that into something that you mentioned earlier. You said there's a large expat community. The reality is 90% of the population in the UAE is expats.
It's quite exceptional on the global scale. It's quite exceptional on
It's quite exceptional. Absolutely. No, I agree with you. So 90% being expats. And there's always been that mindset with expats. No, I want to have 100% ownership of my company. But it's not just about the whole 100% ownership, which encourage people to work with free zones or mainlands. The reality is it also very much falls into the type of activity that they want to conduct. So I'll give you an example. In one of my previous roles, I was working for a multinational. They were a free zone company. They had their products and services sold throughout the region to our distributors here in the UAE and abroad. It made sense for them to have a free zone entity. While for others, if you wanted to, let's say, import and export items within the UAE, no, we would then recommend mainland. If you want, for instance, real estate companies, that would definitely be mainland. If you want to open restaurants and things along those lines, that would be mainland. So the point I'm trying to make, there's thousands and thousands of activities. When we consult to a potential customer, we don't just look at is the 100% ownership or not. We look at what activity they actually want to conduct. What are their plans for the short term? What are the plans for the medium and long term? More importantly, who are their clients? Where do they want to sell and distribute? And from there, we can provide them with whether or not mainland or free zones would be applicable to them. So there's
Thanks for elaborating. That's very interesting because the question often comes up like, do I have to partner up with an Emirati? How much does a local partner want to, take of my company, and how much he or she willing to facilitate or invest in my company? And it always comes up, and
it does come up. It was always
one of the first questions, really.
One of the first questions, and that was one of the things that used to probably encourage people to go with free zones other than mainland. But ever since them changing the whole 100% corporate law, you did see some sort of people diverted to mainlands, but it hasn't been, in my opinion, something that drastically affected the amount of people that required or requested for free zones, because like I said, it's not the only factor. And keep in mind the whole 51% ownership, that was on the trade license itself, but there's always agreements with that local sponsor on the side protecting the real interests of the owners themselves. So the activities, what they want to do, who they are selling to, who their clients are, who their vendors are, what their plans for the short, medium, and long term are, all these things are taken into consideration and factored in before we consult which is more appropriate for them.
Thank you. I think this is a very interesting way to look at it. It kind of negates the traditional view that free zones are always, free zone licenses are very friendly, and especially when it comes to sole ownership. Whereas mainland licenses are always, kind of a traditional, kind of backwards thing. But looking at it from the kind of activity the companies focus on is very important.
I have to be honest with you.
Very fresh outlook, yeah.
Yes, no, I agree with you. I personally, as a person that works for a company like Virtue Zone, and we close, give or take, or support almost 400 to 500 companies per month. If you ask me, do I have a preference right now? No, I don't. I can't have a preference because as an employee, I can look at it from the advantages and disadvantages for both. But more importantly than that, if I was to set up my company, knowing what I know, I would know which direction I would go to. But they can both be very easy and they can both be very complex. I mentioned earlier, there's 52 different free zones. Not all free zones have the same requirements. Not all free zones have the same timelines and procedures and documentations required. They tend to be quite different in many cases. So a company like Virtue Zone, for instance, is able to facilitate and guide those potential customers through all those complexities and make their lives significantly easier.
Well, that sounds great. On that point, maybe you could take us quickly to the, top licenses or license categories that Virtuzone provides, or packages, whatever you want to call
Sure. Packages, I'll give you an example. So because of Virtuzone's size and its relationship with many of the government authorities and jurisdictions, we don't necessarily have a preference. It's something that we hold very close to our heart, that we don't try to push one specific free zone to the client because we have a good relationship with them. It's the fact that we work with so many different jurisdictions is because ultimately we consult and we advise that client what is good for them. You will find many other CSPs, of course, without mentioning, they would be working on 1, 2, or 3 jurisdictions, and you would see that everything that their advice is going to be around those. That's something that differentiates Virtuzone. No, we're open to working with everyone. We have very good relationships with the majority of free zones. But more importantly, we have those relationships and we work with everyone because we know our number one goal is when the client comes to us, we provide him or her with a solution that is good for them and not necessarily good for anyone's bottom line. It's making sure that the client leaves knowing that we took care of them, we made sure that we got them. And many times we actually recommend packages and licenses that are more cost effective, significantly more cost effective, but that's what would be appropriate for that customer and for what they have in mind. So it's never about selling the most expensive. It's never about selling the cheapest. It's about selling what's good for that client.
Well, this flexibility, I think, will feel very reassuring for most startups. Ironically, it happened to a friend of mine not last year. He was just going for a free zone license, and it turned out like a mainland license was much more convenient and even more cost effective. Things have changed, I suppose. Now, more specifically, we got businesses that want to expand, and they also ask if would it be more cost effective and legally easier to start from the UAE, to set up and start from the UAE, rather than expand and open up a branch or a regional head office in the UAE. And is that kind of a broad topic, or how would you respond to that?
Sorry, can I chime in?
Please, Yusuf.
Yeah. So the short answer would be, it is actually more cost effective to just start afresh in the UAE, right? The reason being is if a foreign company is looking to create a subsidiary or a branch, there is a document attestation process that needs to happen beforehand. And what usually that entails is each document that needs to be attested comes at a fee, right? And it has to be done at the original country's consulate. It is more time consuming. So when you add in all of those factors together, it is most definitely a simpler process in terms of administration work and a quicker process to just start it fresh and just have the UAE company based, with an individual shareholder as opposed to a corporate shareholder. Now, obviously, we do both, but just to kind of, in answer to that question, the short answer, as I mentioned, would be it would be much more cost effective to set up a single shareholder entity within the UAE.
Thank you.
And to add to Yusuf's absolute correct point, starting here in the UAE, and then if they want to expand any of the attestation documents, any of the additional legal documents that they require, because the UAE's infrastructure is so developed. I'll give you an example. I wanted to do one of the attestations for my daughter's education certificate in Beirut. It took me quite some time. So I'm not saying, that's absolutely understandable, but the fact that the UAE has all of these various different infrastructures in place and done so professionally makes the life easier for entrepreneurs to start and then expand.
Thank you. Since we're now talking more about business setup logistics, the second question comes into mind. Setting up a bank account and financial transactions, and these kinds of questions come up. So, what's your take on that, Peter and Yusuf?
Very, very good question. One of the concerns many people have had in the past, depending on who they work with, is that they would be able to open up their license, open up their company, and then it would be very difficult for them to be able to get a corporate bank account. Now,
We
that's
experienced it ourselves.
You experience it yourself. Compliance here with the banks tend to be quite stringent for a good reason, because they are trying to maintain the level and, more importantly, match the level internationally. The good thing is companies like VirtuZone understand those compliance requirements. And we have services specifically for bank account opening. And the reason we're able to do that and facilitate that is because we speak the bank's language. We know what they're looking for. We know what they care about finding out. So we make sure that that process is done in a way that the bank comprehends and understands and looks for. And we make sure we facilitate that entire process. I would be lying to you if I told you we didn't have a very high success rate. We do have a very high success rate for corporate bank accounts. With that said, there are always the rare, very rare situations, depending on the person's nationality or a background check that takes place, that stops the process. And that's something that is not in our control and is not even anyone else's control. It has to do with that specific individual. But those are by far the very, very rare cases. The majority of cases, and we have, as head of B2B, I have lots of agents and partners. Other than the fact that we sell directly to customers and we promote directly to customers and individuals like Yusuf who consult directly to customers. I have a very large network of other CSPs, other companies that actually provide similar services that we do, that actually buy and source their products and jurisdictions and licenses from us. And the reason they do that is because they know our efficiency and because we're able to facilitate certain things that they may have not developed as of yet. So bank account has always been and has been a concern for many individuals setting up here in the UAE. But if you're consulting with the right individuals and with the right companies, by far the majority of cases can be resolved.
Thank you. I mean, that's one less thing to worry about, I guess, for entrepreneurs and startups. We get more specific questions. I'm not sure if it's, as we get questions like, okay, what's the minimum amount, what's the deposit, any nationalities that require more paperwork, would you be able to tell them off the cuff? Just
absolutely. If I wish I would be able to give you a single answer. The reality is every bank is different. The minimum amount that needs to be deposited with one bank varies with another bank.
Sorry, but would that depend on the kind of license and kind of activity?
It depends on a variety of things. License type and activity, absolutely. And I'll give you more specific. So a decent portion of the licenses that people in the UAE use are called flexi desks, which means that they have a license with a set number of visa quotas that they can have onto that license. And they, in essence, don't have a physical office required. They may have a tenancy agreement or a flexi desk option to go into that jurisdiction and work for a couple of hours. Now, for those types of licenses, banks don't look at them as favorably because there's no physical office that is located for that entity. But the reality is, even for those types of licenses, many banks, as long as they're being consulted in the correct way and as long as they're supporting documentations like an ijari, even if it's a personal household ijari, something to tie it in all together, those banks and many of them do facilitate for flexi desks because they understood that a big portion of the market are those types of licenses. And ultimately, they understand that these are SMEs. They don't necessarily want to go and hire or rent, a office and pay for fit out and electricity and deal when it's a 2-person company or a 3-person company. It doesn't make financial sense. More importantly, from an SME perspective, we have to always understand that we need to, and something that the UAE supports and the bank supports and VirtuZone supports is these SMEs are starting up. So if we can minimize the unnecessary costs and overheads on them while still allowing them to do the type of operations they want to do, whether it be consulting or whatever else it may be, it makes sense. And that's why there is such a large demand for those types of licenses. Now, for Mainland, for instance, an absolute requirement for a Mainland license is an ijari. That's an absolute requirement, an ijari for that corporate entity. not necessarily where the person lives, but where that physical office is going to be located. And because there's an Ijari and because it's a mainland licenses, many banks, more banks, I'm going to say, prefer those types of licenses. But the difference in price varies drastically. Some requirements varies drastically. So the reality is it could be either or. Flexi desk options with the free zones, which all free zones provide. Absolutely, there's a banking solution for them, a good banking solution that provides them all the services that they require. The only difference is if, let's say, you could approach 30 banks with a DED license, you might be able to approach 10 banks with a flexi desk. I'm giving you just round numbers here.
You touched upon a point here. So we get questions also like, if I'm going to get a mainland license, would I have to make payments or deposits required by a Ministry of Commerce or Dubai Chamber of Commerce or things like that? Are you aware of such?
So it's not necessarily so once again, it goes back down to the activity. The activity dictates all aspects of what type of third-party approvals they require. So there isn't a one solution, one requirement for all, and everyone else can just get any type of activity. So it very much varies depending on the activity. If someone wanted to sell, for instance, fire safety goods, safety lights, fire extinguishers, things along those lines, it's trading, it's a commercial entity, but they would require to buy civil defense approvals. They would require X, Y, and Z approvals. So depending on the activity itself, there may be third-party approvals required, yes.
So there are overlaps, for example, because, for example, I'm just saying lots of people are interested in e-commerce and selling online and things like that, but depends on the kind of product from what I understand from you. So if the product requires any further approvals or checks?
As e-commerce is quite general. Yusuf, you want to say something? I'll give it to you in a minute. E-commerce is quite general. That's a form of trading through an online portal of sorts. No, it doesn't in that sense. It's not the type. He could be selling mobile phones. He could be selling, cups or whatever it may be. There's various different avenues in which they would be able to sell it, whether it's through drop and ship, through Amazon services, through many logistical providers internally. So it's not necessarily e-commerce, and it depends on the type of product that they're selling. No, it depends on the type of license, whether it's an e-commerce license or whether it's a garments trading license. It's those types. That's what I mean specifically. Yusuf, you want to say something?
I was just basically going to mention what you had just mentioned, right? When it comes to e-commerce, which happens to be, one of the most frequent requests I receive, when it comes to e-commerce, essentially, it is very generic, very broad. It allows someone to do trade of most products. If anything, it's actually easier to single out what you're not allowed to sell online. So it's pretty straightforward. It's controlled substances like alcohol or medicine, or any kind of food that you consume. And that is essentially it. You just need to, one thing I didn't mention is gold. So apart from that, you can tell it's quite general and open as to what you can sell online.
Correct.
All right, thank you. So back to the office requirements. This is one of the key questions we get. So can we say, Peter, as a general rule, mainland licenses require a physical address almost all of the time, or all the time? Free zone licenses can be much more flexible.
We can say it, yes, we can say it in that way. I'll give you an example. When you're doing a mainland license, the first step is you get the initial approval and the name reservation. The next step is getting the Ijari. So getting the Ijari is a requirement before you can continue with the rest of the licensing procedure. And then you go for the MOA, signing and notary, and if there's any third-party approvals, you get that as well. And sometimes the third-party approvals are even before the MOA. So yes, for mainland licenses, an Ijari is mandatory. Ijari, I'm sorry for all of our viewers, Ijari is the terminology that they use over here. It's a registered real estate contract. So the Ijari is a requirement for mainland licenses. Now, the Ijari itself can vary. It can vary from a physical office to a large 25 physical cubicle office. It could be 2-3 floors, or it could be a single desk inside a business center. So it varies in types, but an Ijari is required. Now, when we look at free zones, by far the majority of free zones, as part of their license service, they provide you with a lease agreement. That lease agreement, depending on the jurisdiction itself, will give you access to that free zones business center where you could have a flexi desk, you could go work, have a cup of coffee. Even in those free zones themselves, they have business centers where you can rent a physical office that's yours with your lock and your key and your name board and everything else inside the free zone as well. And so they provide those options as well. Now, for many of the flexi desk licenses, similar to the Lebanese support package, you are provided with a license and you're provided with a tenancy contract. That tenancy contract is there to facilitate bank account opening, and it provides you with certain services as well. So when it comes to requirements for free zones, no, an Ijari is not required. But for mainland, it is.
All right. Last point on logistics. Should the person, the company owner or entrepreneur, owner of the startup, be in the UAE physically in order to commence this process, or how does that happen?
The short answer is no. They do not have to be physically present to start the process. As a matter of fact, a decent portion of my agents' clients, and of course many clients from VirtuZone, are clients that are based in Europe, in the West, in various areas around the world, and they have the intent to move into the UAE and to establish their lives here in the UAE or establish their corporate entity. And so the process can start and a license can be provided for individuals that are based outside of the UAE. Now, once the license is issued, immigration card needs to be established. If it's a Northern Emirate, we require something called e-channel, so we're able to put residence visas on that. For mainland, e-channel doesn't apply. But when we want to do a residency for that individual, that person must have visited or been to the UAE in the past, because there's something called a UID that's required, a unique identification for that individual. So we can start with the establishment card. And then we can provide that person with an out-of-country entry permit. That means that person would receive his first residency permit, the first step of it, which had gone through a security check and was vetted by immigration and then issued. And once that's issued, he can fly into the country on that e-visa sticker, which is his first step. So he can then continue the process that does require him to be physically present here, like the medical test and the Emirates ID registration and the biometrics, and of course for the visa stamping itself. So for the license issuance itself, no, it's not a requirement. As a matter of fact, as a result of COVID, many of the free zones have provided a variety of different tools to streamline people being whether stuck at home or out of the country to do, for instance, verified signatures. You would do a Zoom meeting with the authority itself, sign the MOAs in front of them while speaking to them, sometimes holding your passport, proving that you are that individual. So many free zones have many policies and procedures in place that have been designed to streamline that entire process. So no, license issuance isn't necessarily, the person doesn't have to be here, but for part of the residency process, yes, of course he does.
Great to know. You answered both of my questions, actually.
2 birds with 1 stone, not bad, Yusuf.
Really. So when it comes to kind of more of the legal requirements, would at any point, just to set up and register, would a startup or an entrepreneur be required to consult with a lawyer or hire a lawyer, UAE, or is that taken care of as part of the VirtuZone packages?
So just to break down your question, the way the question is formed, it appears like there's an understanding by some individuals that lawyers do need to be consulted before they set up their company.
Does it depend on case by case?
No, it depends on whether the client wants to consult a lawyer to see, but with the far majority of, I would want to say all of the people that set up their companies, they rely on companies like Virtuzone to provide them with all the legal and technical advice of how to do and how to set up a company correctly here in the UAE. I'm not saying we're lawyers, but we're consultants specialized in forming companies. So the advice that we have, with all my respect, will be more informative than the advice that a lawyer can give when it comes to company formation specifically. With that said, depending on the complexity of the type of company he wants to set up, then yes, maybe consulting a lawyer and making sure that the format of what they want to do and how they want to do it, whether it's an offshore company, a holding company with companies underneath, all of these things that we of course advise on as well. But yet, depending on the complexity of the license itself, coming from a multinational, setting up a new branch here in the UAE, they may want to consult a lawyer to make sure that that establishment is being done in line with the regulations of that company being based in Germany or that company being based somewhere else. So consulting a lawyer is always a good thing. We as part of our services provide legal consultancy as well for many specific things. But is it a requirement to consult a lawyer to set up a company? Absolutely not. Does it happen depending on the complexity of the situations? Absolutely, and we encourage it as well. But by far, the far majority, they rely on professional consultants that know the industry, know the legalities, the technicalities, how to do it, what are the ways around it to make sure it is being done correctly. And that's exactly what Virtuzone does. And that's what's made us so successful.
Great. Does that extend to trademarking and intellectual property protection? Some have concerns, about their intellectual property being pirated or stolen, their ideas for startups being stolen in sort of unfair competition, unfair market competition.
Yes. So those types of services, intellectual property, trademarking, those are specific third-party services that are available here in the UAE. When people set up their company, and even sometimes before they set up their company, they do reserve their trademarks and intellectual property. The majority of cases, it is after the license is issued itself, because for the trademark, sometimes when they require a specific name, they may have had a name called ABC Consulting based out of Germany or France or wherever. When they want that specific name here in the UAE, that may not be available because it's taken by somebody else. So they would usually issue the license first, and based on that license, they would consult third-party specific service providers for trademark and intellectual property protections.
So this will be included in the price fee.
Okay. Fine. So more kind of financials here.
Sure. That's my favorite part.
Oh, okay. Everyone's favorite part. Can you elaborate on taxation, corporate tax laws, and in general, because Dubai is known as a kind of a tax-free haven, so that had that reputation for many years. But with the advent of new taxation laws, what would you tell our prospective startups?
Technically speaking, it's still a tax haven, because although corporate tax will be applied as of next year, June of next year, depending on the fiscal year of that company's records. For some companies that have fiscal year ending December, it would start at that point. What you put that aside, the corporate tax, which I'll get into in just a moment, there is no income tax here. VAT is 5%. So many of the expats that have set up companies here didn't necessarily set it up because of the fact that there was no corporate tax, although that is a wonderful thing, but because of the income tax as well. We all know in Europe, in the West, and in Asia, the type of corporate income tax there is, which can range from 30, 40, and 50%, depending on the bracket that they're in. Now, with regards to corporate tax, if we had this conversation a month ago or 2 months ago, I would still say, nope, 0% corporate tax, but you are correct. You are correct. They have announced the 9% corporate tax, which will be applicable as of June of next year, depending on the fiscal year of that company. Now, even at 9%, if we compare it to the rest of the world, even places like Delaware, which are known as tax havens for corporate entities, or places in Asia, 9% is still, in my opinion, some of the most cost-effective corporate taxes there are anywhere in the world. So it will obviously be something that people have to factor into their balance sheets, and it's something that they have to factor into their budgets. But ultimately speaking, for the services that are provided here in the UAE and for the ease of doing business and the infrastructure that's provided, I think the majority of companies will not be bothered by that. Now, your next question, and I'm seeing you looking at the piece of paper, is going to be, Peter, what's the difference between corporate taxes for free zones and mainland? Am I kind of right?
Almost there, yes.
Almost there. So mainlands will have the 9% corporate tax. Free zones, or free zone companies that work outside, so they're based here in the free zone, but work with clients outside of the UAE, let's say a local distributor, because of the logistics infrastructure that they have here. You have many local providers, logistical providers. Those people that import items into the free zone, they don't pay tax or value-added taxes because it's still within the free zone. It's not cleared, and then resell it to the other parts of the GCC or other parts of the world. Those people will not have corporate tax applicable to them because they are not
These
selling
the re-exporters.
The exporters, re-exporters. So people that use the infrastructure here in the UAE, and even companies. There are many trading companies that have a physical entity here in the free zone, but the majority of their clients are based in many areas around the world. So those people that are working exclusively with people with companies and customers and clients outside of the UAE will still not have taxes associated to them. Now, with that said, the law came out. There's been a lot of information provided, but there are still a lot of information that is still required to make it very clear on the ins and outs of what will be applicable, what will not be applicable. An example being, they say free zone companies that work with the mainland will be taxed at 9%. So there's a lot of potential scenarios that can be developed over the next year or so that still has not been defined by the government itself. But more and more information is being presented, and the concept of 9% corporate tax for companies working within the UAE and selling within the UAE is going to start, yes.
All right, so that's something they should watch out for, but not too concerning.
Watch out for, I say just factor in.
Factor.
Yeah.
So speaking of financials and taxation, when would a company need to, or a small startup, let's say of 1, 2, 3, or 4 people, need to hire an accountant, or is it mandatory by law? Or is there a kind of collective, let's say, accounting services provided by free zones, all free zones?
Okay. Another excellent question. You're on a roll to me. One nice question after the next. Value added tax, VAT, the 5%. The question can be, when do they have to apply for VAT registration? There are 2 thresholds. One threshold is the mandatory threshold in which they have to apply for VAT registration and get their TRN number, their tax reference number, is when they pass 375,000 dirhams worth of revenue, not profit, worth of revenue for items and goods sold within the UAE. That's the mandatory threshold. The non-mandatory threshold, the voluntary threshold, is 187,500, if my mind serves me correctly. At that point, if you wanted to register for VAT, you are allowed to. Prior to that point, the tax authorities will say, please leave us alone. We don't want you. You have not reached the threshold. Stay without VAT. Now, the 375,000, after they've registered for VAT, that's when they are obligated to start charging VAT services, VAT tax, forgive me, on their invoices for professional fees, for services, for whatever it may be. That money ultimately goes back to the government, but there are so many intricacies to how that company itself can also claim VAT for things that they are paying VAT for. So other than them selling their service and charging VAT and paying that government, they're sometimes buying services and paying VAT. So there's a way to balance that and claim VAT as well. So a VAT conversation can go for the next 2 hours. I'm happy to stay with you for another 2 hours, but I don't think you want to hear my voice for the next 2 hours.
Always happy to have.
But to answer your question in short, 375,000 is the mandatory requirement for VAT registration.
So any company that reaches this threshold and doesn't register will face consequences.
Absolutely. For goods sold within the UAE, correct.
Goods sold. So beyond the setup, people ask about hiring, recruiting, and hiring employees. There's also the co-working space environments and any stimulus packages that the government provides or Virtual provides.
So
what would you say
about stimulus package? I'm not sure we would define it as a stimulus package, but it's definitely a customized package for various different demographics. For instance, the Lebanese support package. We made sure that we provided a option with a jurisdiction that is, 1, cost effective, 2, very reputable, 3, has an activity list that is vast, whether it be trading or professional. We factored all those things into consideration, and more importantly, we also looked at who the demographic was and what are the things that they would require to complete the entire process. So if my mind serves me correctly, other than the licenses and the complete residency costs and the airline tickets and the visit visas for Lebanese wanting to come in so they could continue with the processes required for the actual residencies, we've combined all of those and we've heavily subsidized them to make sure that it's truly a support package, and whatever we can do to help not just Lebanese, of course, but in this specific case, Lebanese, it's our duty and our privilege and our honor. So incentives can be ranging in the forms of whether discounted prices or additional services being provided. Governments themselves, of course, provide some things similar to that, may not be necessarily to specific nationalities, but the type of entrepreneur that person wants to be. So there are a variety of different options. And to touch into the Lebanese support package, if we look at, I'm not sure if the participants will be having access to the package that we had provided you. It's a one-stop, no hidden fees, complete package that provides that person, that entrepreneur, with everything that they could possibly require for a very, very cost-effective price.
Great to hear that we're facilitating this package for Lebanese entrepreneurs. You know, they've been hard hit by everything that's going on and everything that's coming in the near future, unfortunately.
What I can commit to Tamim, forget myself, forget Yusuf, forget the fact that our CEO is Lebanese Canadian, but Lebanese. The culture within Virtue Zone has always been there to ultimately provide the best possible solution for its clientele. It was never about profit generation. Profit is something that comes naturally when you provide a good service, when you make sure that the customer is happy with what they got, they recommend theirs. You know how much stronger a referral is or a recommendation is versus just hearing an advertisement on the radio or on social media or on Google AdWords.
Definitely.
We believe in this notion. We don't look or run after making money wherever we can make money. We look primarily after the service and making sure that the person is provided for and everything that we could facilitate, and that they leave happy. They leave saying that these people took care of me. So the Lebanese support package is one small step of that. We do this all the time, and it's our honor to provide any service and to support any Lebanese expatriate or soon to be potentially expatriate. And we are here to stand by them throughout.
Thank you very much. I mean, there's hardly anything more reassuring than somebody to believe that there's someone that truly cares and truly wants to help. I think many will find your words reassuring. And thank you very much for the elaborate explanation on all the aforementioned points. Would anyone else like to add anything?
I have few questions, if you don't mind. I'm sorry, like I know like we have 1
You can
minute
ask
left.
me as many questions as you want. I don't mind.
Yeah,
that.
Okay, so I have a couple of like specific questions. Okay, so
And Yusuf is going to interject and answer some of your questions as well. I know he's been itching.
So مثلا in Istanbul, if you want to start your business, you have to have an accountant. In Dubai, is that a requirement?
No.
Okay, perfect. I have another question. So does the government provide certain eases for certain nationalities, or does it make things harder for certain nationalities? So if I want to do because
you know what, Yusuf? Because I know the answer to that one, I'm gonna let you answer it for diplomatic.
Okay.
Careful, Sindus.
No. Okay, let me rephrase that.
Go on.
Are there certain extra requirements from certain passport holders, certain nationalities? Are there extra documents required, from certain nationalities?
Yes. The short answer is yes. There is a list, especially when it comes to when you reach the point of immigration in your whole overall setup of the company. Certain nationalities do require a bit more documentation to be presented. And of course, as you can imagine, if there's more documents that need to be presented, the actual setup time of the immigration procedure can be extended as well. However, to address the first part of the question, they don't favoritize certain nationalities, right? It's either.
Yes.
So that's essentially the situation.
Okay. So in return, so they might require certain, I'm not talking about the immigration part, I'm talking about the licensing part and the registration, setting up the company, would that for setting
Not
up a
so much
company
for setting up license. No.
No.
As Yusuf rightly said, the part which differentiates one nationality from the next has to do with the immigration part, the residency, which is the first step, the entry permit, because it goes through a security check. There are some nationalities.
At the licensing stage,
after the license is issued, when it comes to the establishment card, and when it comes to the actual immigration process of the entry permit for the residency, that's when security checks take place. And there are certain countries that are considered or deemed high risk. Now, all that means is that sometimes instead of getting the security clearance after 1 day, it sometimes takes 3 days, or sometimes takes 5 days. For some nationalities, depending on the individual, not necessarily the nationality, it could take longer than that. So it's more of a little bit longer of a process, and there are possible scenarios in which the immigration check can be rejected, and therefore that person cannot have a residency here. Yes.
Okay, totally agree. And so I know at VeggieZone, you guys are providing great, especially the Lebanese support package. It's amazing, and thank you so much. But for from a government, not the government side, I mean the country itself, is it providing any eases for certain? I know, masalan, now for Ukrainians, they provided certain aid, certain incentives. I know. If you want to set up your business in Poland, you get access to a certain number of grants and certain number of loans and certain things that are provided by the authorities to startups. If any startup or any founder now decides to go to the UAE, are there certain programs regarding authorities that they can have access to, kind of incentives to attract?
Absolutely. There are specific jurisdictions that support a very specific type of entrepreneur, whether it could be technology-based or research-based and things along those lines. There are such programs here in the UAE. As I mentioned, there's 52 different jurisdictions. Not all of them obviously provide it. Some do provide it on a very case-to-case basis, but for very specific forms of activities, yes, there are such things.
Okay. Thank you. Those are my questions. I'm sorry I took much.
No,
I
you
took
didn't
extra
take
time.
much time at all.
Oh, absolutely, it's fine.
To be quite honest with you, the person that gave me the most, the largest headache and who's been speaking nonstop is Donna. I mean, you need to ask her a little bit. I'm joking, Donna. I know you're on mute.
Yeah,
I'm just joking.
It's always
Sorry about the headache.
It was an
Any
absolute
questions,
pleasure.
Dana?
everybody.
Sorry.
No, I think you guys beautifully explained everything. It was super clear. So thank you for the session. It was super insightful.
It is our absolute
Welcome.
pleasure. Thank
Thank
you
you,
all
Peter.
for organizing this. We are here to support you any way that you can, and we will stay in touch. And thank you once again.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thanks, everyone.
شرفتونا.
Bye bye.
Take
Thank you,
care.
Sharaf.
Good weekend. Bye bye.
You too. Bye-bye.
Bye bye.